Welcome to Pete's Property Podcast, brought to you by Buyers and hosted by Pete Wargent, buyer's agent, finance and real estate expert, and all-round property guru, plus published author. Join Pete for 30 minutes as he chats all things property with a new guest each week. Learn practical tips from the movers and shakers in the property industry and well-known personalities sharing their property journeys.
G'day, welcome to this week's episode of the Pete Wargent Property Pod. I'm super excited this week to have a very special guest. It's none other than Simon Kuestenmacher from the Demographics Group, social media guru, and most recently I've seen on TikTok as well as a couple of 100,000 Twitter followers. Simon, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you on.
It's great to be on.
Yeah, so real busy period for you guys at the Demographics Group. We've got the census figures coming out and there's global population figures coming out. So first up, tell us a little bit about your background, obviously from Germany originally. Tell us a bit about where you lived and what you studied.
Well, I did grow up in Munich in Germany and went to university in Berlin to study geography, which was kind of fun, but it wasn't quite the right thing. Then developed into human geography. So all of a sudden we're dealing with humans. And then I became an urban geographer, which looked at, population movements within cities. How do people behave? How do cities change? And I figured that was really my field of interest. So I enjoyed that. And then my studies brought me to Tulsa, Oklahoma for a little bit. And then they brought me just originally for one semester to the University of Melbourne. Then I ran into a girl, and that was 14 years ago. So I'm now permanently based in Melbourne and I'm enjoying this. And my particular line of work, meaning looking at population data and big economic data sets and understanding what this means for the future of a country or a city or a small suburb or any particular industry. That's tons of fun. And the job is super easy in Australia because we got fantastic data. You hinted earlier at the Australian census, which we must not underestimate in regards of how powerful it is. The Americans, for example, run a census every 10 years and ask 13 questions. We run a census every 5 years and ask 65 questions. The amount of cross-tabulation, the amount of data insights that we can get out of our data set is insane. So businesses in Australia, if they use the resources available wisely, they have a leg up in regards to what the American colleagues can do.
Yeah, and also I guess Australia has been changing and is changing so quickly. We're big population growth for a developed country. And I mean, you only really have to travel around the country a little bit, which I know you do a lot, to see, from year to year, and particularly over periods of 5 and 10 years, you see tremendous changes in the way in which people live. So having been drawn to the field of demography, you've picked a fantastic part of the world to be in because lots of information, lots of data and lots of changes. Now, I guess you guys have been in red hot demand over the past couple of years because we've seen these sudden shifts in demographic trends, a lot of acceleration of regional renaissance, and then there's a lot of shift to work from home and online retail. So, I guess having done some of my schooling in Germany in the Oberstufe, we could talk all day about your background, but let's crack on to some of the big trends that you've been seeing. I see the retail figures are out this week, and one of the obvious things that I can see from my wife's Amazon account balance is that a lot of people have shifted to shopping online over the past year, which obviously has all kinds of repercussions for commercial real estate. What are you seeing there in terms of online retail, and what do you expect to see going forward?
So the past trend is that we slowly had the share of all Australian retail that takes place online slowly inch upwards. In 2013, which is when we first measured this kind of data, 2% of all retail took place online. And this slowly inched up to 6.5% before the pandemic hit. And had the trend continued at the same pace, we would now be at around 7.5%. of retail that takes place online. That's not too exciting of a shift. It's a slow increase. But what happened as we put Melbourne or Victoria into lockdown first is that we saw the share of retail that takes place online jump to 10.5%. That's 4 percentage points more than what we thought or that what we had before the pandemic. So that's a big shift. And I hear you say 4 percentage points. That's a bit boring. It doesn't sound like much. But every percentage point that shifts from brick and mortar to online translates into $7.5 billion. That's $7.5 billion that are not being spent in a shop, but that are being spent online. From a job perspective, that's not too dramatic. It just means fewer clerks, checkout clerks, a couple of more drivers, a couple of more warehouse workers. So from a job perspective, the balance kind of stays the same. So it's not too dramatic. But what it means is that once you take retail from brick and mortar, some of those brick and mortar shops will have to close because they operate on margins on 10%, 15%. And once you take 15% of their sales away, a small shop, why bother opening up? Because you run a deficit anyways. So therefore, shops close. That is quite dramatic if that happens to a local main street, to your local neighborhood shopping street. You want to avoid this like the plague, so to speak, because that sucks the energy out of local retail precincts. And this happens, funnily enough, in a time when we all realized how important the local neighborhoods is, when people across the country, and particularly in lockdown cities, utilize their local neighborhoods more because they weren't allowed in Melbourne to move more than 5 kilometers away from the home. And then you just really take a liking to all those local retail streets as a destination, as a community building thing. So that was a problem. But, the lockdown were temporary. They might have been long, but they were temporary. But then when Melbourne opened up at the end of 2020, there was a short period of opening. And then the retail sales didn't drop back down to pre-COVID normals. They stayed at an elevated rate of about 9.5% or thereabouts, which is above what we would have expected to be there. So 2.5 percentage points of a permanent shift, simply because we ran 7 million Victorians through a collective behavior change program where they learned new behaviors. There were plenty of older Victorians in particular who for the first time ordered stuff on Amazon, on eBay. And they thought, that's kind of handy. Now that I have the skill to do so, I might continue doing this. We, in my little family, we ordered groceries online for the first time from supermarket. That's kind of handy. So we stuck with it. This is a behavior that is now part of our shopping, everyday life. So that stuck. And then the retail sales that take place online reached even higher levels when Sydney, the poor Sydney-siders, joined Melbourne in lockdown towards the end of 2021. So everything was in lockdown. You had really high sales. And then at the start of 2022, you found a new level because we put even more Australians, New South Welshmen, into this behavior change program. So the big story here is, of course, for retail, that retail shifts. That's somewhat interesting. There's an urban planning element in there, but there's also a broader lesson here, is that the behavior changes that we acquired during the COVID lockdowns, they will stick, not completely, but to a certain degree.
Never been big on retail as an investment, largely because I don't understand it. Things like shops and retail stores. It can be quite a fickle sector of real estate because like the popular shopping strips of yesteryear became less popular when they built the Westfields and so on. What we've seen over the past couple of years, demand for industrial property has been exceptionally strong. I think partly because people are just looking for a place to invest as an inflation hedge. But I think based on what you said, that does make sense. If people are moving towards businesses like Amazon, then there would be more demand for warehouses. I think on the retail side of things, I was down in Melbourne not so long ago after I saw you in the Gold Coast, and there's a lot of empty shops around, and that's unquestionable. But I guess the one caveat there, I was just down in Yandina on the weekend. The coffee shops and some of the cafes, particularly the fine food places where people go for an experience, absolutely full. You couldn't even get into the places. So potentially some of the retail outlets where people go for a human experience, maybe those might fare not so badly?
Oh, absolutely. So the idea is that as a main street, you want to become a location. You want to be sure a destination. You want to be sure that people come there for a purpose, and the people or the business owners in a main street, they never compete against each other. They must get this out of their mindset. It's the idea you want to become a destination as a whole. If somebody goes to the local butcher, they might grab a coffee on the way. If somebody grabs a bit of pet food at the pet store, they might buy dried mangoes at their store next door as well. So there is this network, this ecosystem that people need to become highly aware of from a retail perspective. And of course, we have the shift that because of the working from home movement, that people spend more time during the week in their local neighborhoods. So while you will not spend the money in your CBD for a coffee, but you might either have it at your kitchen counter, so Coles wins out, or you go to your local cafe. And this is when the local cafes fill up even more because you have more population just nearby for longer stretches of time.
One of the things I would have potentially expected from all of the acceleration of the working from home movement is that some of the big commercial landlords, particularly owners of offices, would have really struggled because offices haven't been used so much. But if I was just to take a financial markets look at that, yes, there was an initial impact when we had the lockdowns, but actually a lot of those share prices have been pretty robust, at least until recently, as people are starting to think about rising interest rates, which is a different headwind for the sector. But would I be right in thinking that what financial markets are potentially looking at there is, yes, there's going to be this big shift to working from home, but sometime down the track, immigration is going to start picking up again. Most new migrants tend to go to the inner city areas of Sydney and Melbourne. I guess I was in Sydney in January midweek, and the place was an absolute ghost town. There was nobody in the office, but just in the past couple of weeks at the time of recording, it's just, you can see people starting to get back into the office and the CBD. So are markets there presumably thinking that, look, sometime down the track, the CBDs will return to their pre-pandemic size and even grow above and beyond that?
Oh, absolutely. So the relative importance of the CBDs will be permanently weakened. That means on any given day, a higher share of the workforce will be working from home than before the pandemic. That means those people will not commute into the city. This means those people will not have their bums on a seat in an office tower. Fair enough. That shifts population movements a bit, because if you don't have to commute every day, you're willing to do a longer commute. So therefore, people move to the urban fringe where housing is cheaper. They move to regional Australia where housing is cheaper, but they're not moving into far-flung places. They're moving into places that are within 2 hours driving distance of the CBD. So really, we stretch out the available land a bit more, because people will still need to come to the office occasionally. Fair enough. So we still, at this point, at a weakened CBD. But as cities continue to grow, the CBDs will eventually fill up. We are going to grow Melbourne and Sydney from 5 to 7 million people in pretty much 2 decades. So by then, the CBD will be much, much larger and bigger and powerful than before the pandemic. No, we don't even need 2 decades for this. We need probably 5 years to be at pre-pandemic levels again. I can say this just as a demographer who has an interest in this. I don't have billions of dollars invested into office towers. The urgency here is different if you are financially invested and if you want to have people to move back to the office. What you cannot do is to demand people to go back. That doesn't work, because we went through 2 years of behavior change, particularly in Melbourne, where people will not go back. They want to do their own thing. And in a period of time where we have low unemployment, it is easy to jump job if the boss is evil and doesn't allow you the flexibility. So you can't do this. So there is a period of transition that will be very rocky, so to speak. But it will play itself out with a hyper busy CBD beforehand. But it is also a great opportunity to rethink the way that we want to use our CBD. In the past, you just went there to write, to do all your tasks. So you had plenty of people sitting at their desks with noise-canceling headphones writing emails. That's stupid. I don't want to see this ever again. Why did this poor worker have to commute to the office to put on noise-canceling headphones? That's silly. Just have those quiet tasks, those concentration, individualistic tasks, have them do the workers at home. That's easy. And then for the interpersonal element of their jobs, have them come to the office, because these work tasks, they are better performed in collaboration with colleagues. And so ideally, a worker is able to roughly, it will not be perfect, but roughly split their week into an interpersonal work task days, do those from the office, do the rest at home. And this will shift and will be very different, the split, based on your job, based on your personality, and based on your individual week, because not every week is the same in the world of work. And so in this ideal future where people would actually behave this way, the CBD would be an extremely active place where people collaborate, they talk to one another, they leave the office to go to cafes to catch up with colleagues. So it'd be almost a rowdy, a raucous CBD. That'd be lots of fun to be doing business with, because there are more opportunities for the workers that are in the CBD to spend money on cafes, on networking events. So I think it is worth investigating if you can run your business like this.
Do you want to save on buyer's agent fees? You could save thousands with Buyers Buyers. As Australia's most extensive network of buyer's agents, we can lock in highly competitive prices. Plus, our national network of buyer's agents are some of the best in the business. So get the Buyers Buyers advantage and talk to us today. Call 1-800-975-051 or visit buyersbuyers.com.au.
I read a report some years ago by Infrastructure Australia. No doubt you've read it too, being a demographer. And one of the things they said in the report was infrastructure over the coming decades will be focused on the 8 capital cities plus a range of sort of peri-urban locations, by which they mean Bendigo, Ballarat, Geelong, Central Coast, Newcastle and Wollongong, Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast and Toowoomba, I guess. Now, I guess I saw you present actually at the Gold Coast a few weeks ago, and there was a couple of things that stood out from your presentation. One is you talked about the gravitational pull of the capital cities, which you've just alluded to in this podcast today again there. And also the other thing was the fried egg model of living in cities. So less of a focus on inner city importance, but still within striking distance of employment nodes or transport nodes and employment hubs. So explain to us a little bit about what you mean about the gravitational pull of the capitals, which I think you've touched on already, but also what does the fried egg model of living look like, and what does it mean for the future of living in Australia?
If we start with the fried egg, before the pandemic, the Australian capital cities looked like a fried egg, where all the juicy, fat, delicious jobs were clustered in the egg yolk, and the people lived in the egg white surrounding the yolk. And in order to avoid the soul-destroying commute where you have to sit in a car for hours, or in a stuffed tram, a crowded tram for hours, you paid a premium for your housing to be as close as humanly possible to the CBD. So we ended up with a job center, the CBD, where we had the rich people and the poor people move to the same area to do jobs, because there are plenty of service jobs that are needed to service all the workers that are actually typing away on laptops in the office towers. So rich and poor worked in the same location, but the richer you were, the closer to the CBD you could live. Therefore, the poorer workers had a longer commute, a longer soul-destroying, annoying commute, which means they had less time for their families, and they also had less money. And that's the model of the city that we ran. And along comes the pandemic. The pandemic essentially acted like a spatula that we put into our fried egg model, and we made it more into a scrambled egg, where the jobs are almost evenly distributed across the city because people worked from home. Melbourne at its peak had more than half of the population working from home. That is quite quite a high number, considering that it was 5% in the years before the pandemic. So all of a sudden, you don't need to commute anymore. And if you don't need to commute, you rethink your housing position, because you still live in a suburb where you pay a premium, and the premium of the housing is solely or is mostly reliant on the short commute. So you say, hey, wait a second, I could just move to the urban fringe. I could just move to a regional city in driving distance and get a nicer house for less money. And that's what we've seen in Australia in the 2 years since the pandemic. It's this big shift of people moving from the inner and middle suburbs to the fringe to regional Australia. That said, that was not all working from home. There was also just sheer demographic dumb luck or good fortune, however you want to call it, that the millennial generation, which is the biggest generation in Australia, just happened to reach the family formation stage of the life cycle right now as we enter into the pandemic. That means that the hipster millennials of Surrey Hills, of Fitzroy, that they need to find new places to live. So they leave their 1 or 2 bedroom apartments in order to move into a 3 or 4 bedroom house, because that's what they need. They have a kid, they need a Zoom room because they work from home so much. So that opens up new areas of the city. And therefore, you have this big reshuffling of the population happening. And when I talk about the gravitational pull of a capital city, it means that you cannot move to any old town when you rethink this, because you still have to go to the city quite a bit, not daily, maybe once a week, twice a week. But so therefore, it makes no sense that you move too far out. In Victoria, you would move to Ballarat, to Bendigo, to Geelong. That makes sense. That's commutable. But you don't move to Shepparton, to Horsham, to Portland. You don't do that. And so there is this shift that's happening. And we will still be a country where the capital cities are the most important places. When we talk about population decentralization, we're really talking about a slowdown of growth in the cities in relative terms. Once the borders are open, we will see massive influx of population in the capital cities, because the migrants, you alluded to it beforehand, they always move near the job centers, near the universities. Where else would international students want to live rather than walking distance to their uni? Where else would the young, skilled migrants, they are single largely, they are young, they are inner city renters by default. That is their life stage that they're in. So opening the borders always means a strengthening of the inner city. The fun element here is that we are almost not touching the middle suburbs, because the middle suburbs is currently where we have the baby boomer generation, so a large and rich generation. They occupy the middle suburbs. They live on quarter-acre blocks still, in 4-bedroom homes as empty nesters. Just mom and dad, maybe just mom by now because dad died, and they are not selling their family home. This whole storyline of downsizing isn't really taking place in Australia at the pace that some people might want to make you believe. Australians are stubborn people. They only leave their family home once it becomes a physical hazard, a nuisance to manage. And the downsizing largely happens as a result of necessity rather than out of some sort of smart financial decision. So therefore, because baby boomers are still too young throughout the 2020s, and we will see the middle suburbs not touched too much. There will be a bit of, towers near train stations, near the big commuting corridors. That will still occur. But overall, the housing stock will not change hands all that much in the middle suburbs.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of makes sense. I think thinking back to when I first moved to Sydney, this is before the Olympics. I guess the population back then would be 3.5 or 3.5 million or so. And I could drive from where I was living in the Shire to work in Mascot. I mean, it wasn't fun, but you could do it. But I guess as cities grow from, 5.5 towards 7 million, you can't have everybody doing that. It's just the city's not going to work. And we already had this concept of Sydney and North Sydney, and then Parramatta and Western Sydney as places where people could go to work, and they wouldn't necessarily all have to live so close to the CBD. And that makes perfect sense. But this all seems to have accelerated some of those trends. I guess one of the things, when you look at a country like America, Yes, you've got New York and LA, but you've got a whole range of secondary cities. Most of the states have got a fairly sizable city where you could move to realistically. But in Australia, we seem still even now very urban and very focused on Greater Sydney, Greater Melbourne, Southeast Queensland. And I guess having a German guest on the show, I should ask you about this concept of the Mittelstand, which, look, it's a few years since I lived in Germany, but my understanding of it would be, you've got a lot of sort of small and medium-sized manufacturing businesses, but a much more decentralized economy in Germany, and therefore a much less speculative housing market in many ways. People don't, in places like Surrey Hills or whatever, you're going to speculate on the land value because you can see where it's heading over the next 20 years, but maybe less so in a country like Germany. Because yes, as you mentioned, you've got the big cities like München and Hamburg and Berlin, but even off the top of my head, there's a whole range of sort of smaller or medium-sized cities you could move to, like Cologne or Frankfurt, Essen, Dortmund, Stuttgart, Dusseldorf. Even I'm now thinking of the Bundesliga, Bochum, Dresden. So there's a lot of those sort of cities like Bonn and Mannheim. They're not big, but it seems to be a much more decentralized approach. In Australia, when you look at where you're going to live, for a lot of people, it boils down to where their jobs are. So is that something which could or will change in Australia over time, or do you just see Australia being a very urbanized country? And can you explain to us a bit more about why is Germany different, and particularly with respect to the housing market?
Yeah. So when we look at the way that the population is distributed across Germany. So Germany is a smaller country than Australia, but it has 3 times the population or 3.5 times the population. And so it's almost evenly spread out, the population across Germany. Whereas if you look at a map of Australia, you do know that there are a couple of, it's just vast emptiness in the center. And then there are a couple of small points of population along the coast. That's how we distribute our population. There's no country on the planet where the population is so concentrated in the 5 largest cities than Australia. We have 2/3 of the population living in just the top 5 cities. There's no other country that comes close. Japan is the next one down the line. And there's really just one city in Japan. It's another freak setup there. But so this highly concentrated population is historically grown because you had just had a couple of harbors and then people lived near the harbors, and then you needed a couple of satellite cities for agriculture, for logging. So there wasn't the need for much cities. And each state operated as a separate entity before you really had airlines create this airport network, and we will never have a fast rail network connecting Australia. We're just too far apart from one another, and the population is too small to make this feasible. In Germany, you have 3.5 times the population base, so you have a rail network that can connect people. So it makes sense that you better connect those people, and you faster from one place to the next. So not everybody needs to huddle in just one city. There are only a couple of, you mentioned them, a couple of cities that are big enough and that draw enough population for house prices to go up a lot. Most other middle-sized cities that are almost concentrically around it. If you look at a map of Germany, you'll see a big city surrounded by medium-sized cities, and those medium-sized cities are surrounded by tiny cities. It's Chris Teller's model. So he's an old geographer from the 1930s who pointed this out, and that's the way a country works. So once you have this geographic setup of small cities, that really invites what you said was the Mittelstand, the idea of having tons of mid-sized businesses. We're joking that in Germany, in every city, there's some sort of tiny company that is the world market leader in some bizarre little subsegment of a subsegment in manufacturing ball bearings or screws or something like this. And that's the geographic setup invites this. We will not have this in Australia. When we're talking about population decentralization in Australia, we want to say, let's not put 80% of the population growth in the top 5 cities, which was what happened in the decade before the pandemic. We said, how about we put half of the population growth in our top 5 cities and we spread the rest out a bit more. Southeast Queensland. Why would everybody move to Brisbane? We can stretch this out a bit more. let's have Southeast Queensland operate as one continuous urban area, and we really strengthen the Sunshine Coast, the Gold Coast, even up, down, inland into Toowoomba. And that's exactly what we're doing at the moment. So this is all wonderful. Southeast Queensland will continue to be the biggest, fattest boom region in Australia. They get infrastructure spending brought forward because of the Olympics. And that's what you do in a good Olympic Games, is you bring forward infrastructure spending from the future into the present. And then the city can function better. Plus, you get international name recognition. So that's wonderful. And the decentralization in Victoria will just mean a strengthening of Geelong and Bendigo, really.
Yeah, that's right. And it does seem to go on and on like that. Now, I guess at the time of recording, we're just about 3 weeks out from a federal election. I guess difficult to know what will happen with regards to immigration settings. I did notice in the federal budget, tucked away in the notes there was an assumption that net overseas migration over the next few years will start to ramp back up very strongly. International students have started to come back, maybe not so much from China. There's some issues with Australia's relationship with China. But obviously at the point of recording, we've got a big skill shortage in lots of sectors of the economy, not just hospitality and retail, but things like construction and trades, some of the engineering trades and so on. Guessing that immigration post-election will start to ramp back up again. I know that the fertility rate in Australia is temporarily down, but I guess the thing is, unlike in countries like Japan, or even to a lesser degree, countries like Germany or parts of Eastern Europe, we don't really have the dramatically aging population because, as you mentioned, we've populated a lot with very young people over the past 20 years, hence the boom in household formation. So when I read the intergenerational reports, it always looks to me like Australia is just planning to double its population from 25 million to 50 million to 100 million. With this kind of endless flywheel of immigration and growth. Is that kind of how you see the future for Australia? I know it's not popular with everybody, but are you optimistic about Australia and its demographic makeup, given its location in the world?
Also, I'm extremely optimistic about Australia. So if we start this discussion from the very top level, global population will peak much, much sooner than many people expect. We'll most likely see peak humanity in the 2050s or 2060s, the latest. That means if you are under 40, you'll definitely see peak human population, which is quite a shocking concept because we think about overpopulation. We think about there are too many humans. We will peak human population at around 10 billion, probably less than that. And then population will probably decline for maybe forever. Who knows? But so that's quite a stark picture to think of. And in this shrinking population scenario, in order to afford a high quality of life, to create economic growth, you must be hyper productive. So you can either do this by competing for the few remaining workers, or to become more productive through automation, through robotics. That's the Japanese way. Even though Japan also massively ramped up immigration over the last decade. That's just an aside. But so if you run a country like Australia that is aging, you want to say, well, all those aging folks, we need to finance them somehow. We need to underwrite this. And you can do this by adding enough workers. And there are two ways of adding workers to Australia. One is to have babies and then to feed those babies a lot and then to turn those babies into school students, into university students, into TAFE students. And then at 20, at 25, they join the workforce and they pay tax to make sure that we can afford all the wonderful things in Australia. That's the traditional way of growing a population. If you are a migration nation like Australia, you can also skip the first 20, 25 really expensive years of the life cycle where the state invests money into the kids and just import a fully baked professional worker at the age of 25. That's rather nice. You have no costs leading up to this. These people, if they're international students, even pay an arm and a leg for the education that then by definition, at least theoretically, is fully up to your standards. And they then immediately start paying tax. That really puts, in my mind, international students turning citizens into the ideal citizen based on a purely economic measurement. Of course, no person is better than another person, anything like this. That way of running an economy makes sense to me. Yeah, we also, on top of this, add the superannuation system in Australia, which at least in theory is meant to do one thing for the state. It means that you are forced to put money aside so that you pay for your own retirement. That's the goal. That's the idea behind superannuation. And the superannuation system was, of course, dreamt up in a time when there was a big middle class in Australia. And the middle class and the rich folks, they are always happy and able to pay for their own retirement. What happened in the last 3 decades, really, is that we shrunk the middle class. We took away manufacturing jobs, for example, the classic middle-class jobs, and we created lots of jobs on the bottom, gig economy type jobs. And those low-income gig economy job workers, they don't earn enough money over a lifetime of 30, 40 years or working career of 30, 40 years to finance their own retirement. So we need to subsidize low-income workers of today into the future through the pension system. And so that whole system doesn't work, the superannuation system, if we have too many low-income workers. It just means the rich and middle-class workers need to subsidize the existence of low-income workers. So that's a problem that I'm seeing. And in order to make sure that we can afford to do this, we can just amp up the workforce by importing more workers. At the moment, every industry is desperate for workers. We have a super low unemployment rate. So if we look at the future ahead, the next year or so, about half of the migrants coming into the country are skilled workers. That'll be about 90 to 100,000 skilled workers will be coming into Australia over the next year. And every industry will be fighting for their particular jobs that they need to be coming into the country. And, so there'll be a bit of shuffling. We can take nurses and doctors, of course, a couple of engineers, construction workers, because we have all those infrastructure planned and we don't have enough workers there. So we do all of this. But that means there's still room to grow for the economy. And we will be doing this if this makes sense.
Yeah, I think Australia has done very well out of people like myself and you. We do a lot of our study overseas. I came in as a skilled migrant and paid nearly all of my tax in Australia. So it kind of makes sense. You're lowering the average age when you coming in your productive years, paying tax and funding dependency ratio, I guess. A final question for you, just before we round off. I guess we've got all these people coming into Australia, but I saw some figures from REA Group yesterday, and the number of rental properties available has absolutely plummeted. It's down about 27% from a year ago, and it was already low a year ago. Now, this, for a lot of people, this doesn't seem to make any sense. I think you've potentially suggested the reason for it, which is the big boom in household formation in youngsters. But if I understand correctly, we lost a lot of temporary visa holders through the pandemic, and yet still there's nowhere available to rent. What's going on there?
Largely, this is a supply issue. Remember that even though we lost migrants in net terms over the last year, we still grew because we had more births and deaths. So the country still grew as a whole. So that doesn't really mean a big easing of the housing market. It's you still grow the population base. And there is also a mismatch in stock, meaning you have the biggest housing stock that's needed, that is in demand, are 3 and 4 bedroom homes. And the bit of stock that's available is smaller apartments. So that doesn't really add up. So therefore, there is a crunch. Plus, you had population shift from the inner city to the urban fringe to the regional cities. And in a regional city, these are areas that usually operate on tiny growth each year. And so you only need to add a couple more hundred people than expected to have the housing market go absolutely through the roof. And the people that suffer the most are, of course, renters, wherever you look, because rents go up for sure. That's a problem. And young people who can't move or who can't afford to move out of the parental home. So really the parents are victims as well. But that means, what do you do in those housing markets? Well, you then need to provide housing. There is only few workers available. What kind of housing are those workers building? Those developers, they're going to build the higher margin end of the spectrum. They are going to build houses for 3 and 4 bedrooms, with families that can afford it. And so once again, the lower half of or lower third really of the workforce is missing out the most. So the disconnect between rich and poor in Australia has only gotten worse. Everyone will forever in Australia complain about house prices because there's no way that any political party does do anything to improve housing affordability. Don't listen, in my opinion, I'm very harsh here. Any of the policies that I've read so far about are absolute nonsense and will do nothing to fix housing affordability. Not the slightest. They might as well not put them in there. But they do this for, just... It's crocodile tears, really. They're crying. And it's a bit of a politicking. But so that's annoying to me personally. It is just a matter of improving supply. On top of this, you have the issue that building houses got freakishly more expensive with supply chain crunches. So we need to find ways of building houses at scale, affordable costs, just the house, literally the building costs went up. So we can do something to fix land costs by making more land available, by making mixed use areas easier. So there's rezoning, there's land availability as an issue, and then there is just building housing at scale. If you want to fix housing affordability in Australia, I think we would need to have the state or the government act as a developer. At least, experiment with these things. We are in such dire straits, we might as well try it and might as well have the government act as a developer and just see whether it works or whether it is a catastrophe. And you start with a couple of thousand units, so there is no big loss there if you completely screw it up. Yeah,
I saw some figures this week. The number of or the share of the population in social housing or housing commission is now only 3%. It was 6% in 1995. So governments have largely stepped away from the construction or provision of new social housing. And it just seems to be there was just a brief period during the financial crisis, during the Rudd stimulus, but otherwise they just won't seem to touch it. And I guess the reason it's of concern to me is that we know that most new arrivals to Australia tend to be renters initially, and yet at the moment there's no rental stock. So, Simon, you're going to be a busy man over the coming month or two with the new census data dropping and all the other stuff that's happening at the moment. If people want to find out more about Simon Kuestenmacher, I already mentioned your social media guru busting your moves on TikTok and also big following on Twitter. But if people want to find out some more about yourself and the demographics group, where can they go for more?
Well, for the business website is tdgp.com.au. That's short for the demographics group. Because you can't get 3-letter websites. So that's the official website. My personal website is simonk.com.au. But most active, I'm on Twitter, I'm on LinkedIn, and for the last 2 weeks I have been trying to learn how to TikTok and how to tell demographic stories on TikTok.
Yeah, I think I'm marking myself down as Generation X there because I've got no idea when it comes to TikTok. I can just about manage Twitter. So, Simon, thank you so much for coming on. It's always great to get your in-depth insights into demographics, what's happening in Australia and what's coming down the track, because as they say, demographics are destiny. Yeah, thank you so much and hope to speak to you again soon.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Pete's Property Podcast, powered by Buyers. Don't forget to subscribe and join us next time as Pete chats all things property with a new guest. And just a reminder that the information provided in this podcast is general advice only and doesn't take into account your personal financial situation or needs. You should always consult a licensed professional to discuss your individual personal circumstances.